Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a sequence of events so deeply catastrophic, it literally changed the way the entire world looks at energy, at safety, and at whether we can actually trust the people in charge. We're breaking down the absolute worst nuclear disaster in human history, the day humanity poisoned the Earth.
Picture this. It's April 26, 1986. There are no warning sirens going off. There's no missile strike from an enemy nation. The ground isn't shaking from an earthquake. It's just quiet. But then, in a fraction of a second, at exactly 1:23 in the morning, a machine built to power millions of homes suddenly transforms into a weapon of invisible destruction. That quiet, completely ordinary night was violently shattered, unleashing a massive, silent threat that was about to spread all the way across the globe. Section 1. The Soviet Dream, the Illusion of a Nuclear Utopia.
Okay, to really wrap our heads around how this happened, we gotta travel back to the 1970s. The Soviet Union was locked in this intense race to prove to everyone that their technology was just completely unmatched. And nuclear energy, that was their ultimate flex. So they built the massive Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant using these cutting-edge RBMK reactors. But here's the fascinating part. To run this colossal plant, they literally built a brand new city right next door called Pripyat. And the average age of the 49,000 people living there, just 26 years old. This wasn't some grim industrial work camp, it was a utopia. We're talking new schools, pristine swimming pools, amusement parks, the whole shebang. Everyone living there honestly thought they were stepping into the future. They had absolutely no idea their perfect city was about to become a permanent ghost town.
So let's look at the timeline of that night, because it is just a cascade of catastrophic choices. And ironically enough, the whole thing started with a safety test. On April 25th, the engineers wanted to see if the plant's spinning turbines could keep the emergency generators running if the main power completely failed. Makes sense, right? But as the hours dragged on, the reactor's power levels started dropping unexpectedly. To force the test to keep going, operators made some incredibly dangerous tweaks and intentionally bypassed crucial safety systems. Finally, at exactly 1:23 and 40 seconds in the morning, they pressed the emergency shutdown button for reactor number 4. But pressing that button didn't shut things down. It did the exact opposite. Power surged totally out of control inside that highly unstable core. And then, boom, a massive explosion utterly obliterated the reactor. And seconds later, a second blast was so powerful, it blew the 2,000-ton reactor lid straight up into the night sky. I mean, concrete shattered like glass, heavy steel twisted like tinfoil, and the radioactive core was completely exposed to the open air. This was literally the first open-air nuclear explosion in history. And out of the smoking ruins of that reactor, an invisible enemy was born. That blast instantly vomited lethal radioactive materials straight into the atmosphere. We're talking iodine-131, cesium-137, strontium-90, and plutonium. Now imagine you're a resident in Pripyat. You step out onto your balcony because you hear a noise, and you see this beautiful, eerie glow in the sky above the plant. You just stand there marveling at it, right? And that's exactly what families did, completely unaware they were breathing in pure poison, a toxin they couldn't see, couldn't smell, and couldn't taste.
And the gap between what the first responders expected and the reality they walked into is just heartbreaking. When the firefighters rushed to the scene, they genuinely believed they were dealing with a standard, everyday industrial fire. They showed up in regular canvas gear with normal water hoses, no radiation suits, nothing. But the reality? They were literally walking on top of glowing nuclear reactor debris. Some of these guys even picked up chunks of highly radioactive graphite with their bare hands to clear the path. Pretty quickly, they started tasting metal in their mouths and feeling their skin physically burn. They were unknowingly handed a death sentence that night, but their incredible bravery is the only reason the fire didn't engulf the other 3 reactors.
Section 2. The Cover-Up, Silence, and the Ghost City. Now, you might be wondering, what did the government do while this lethal radiation was blanketing the area? Well, their official response was basically just silence. They were so terrified of looking bad on the global stage that they chose secrecy over human lives. Just a mile away from a burning, exposed nuclear core, life in Pripyat just carried on like any other Saturday. Kids went out to play, people went to work. But you can't hide a nuclear disaster forever. 2 days later, and literally thousands of miles away in Sweden, scientists at a completely different power plant started detecting massive, unexplained spikes in radiation. They checked the wind currents and traced it straight back to the Soviet Union.
It was only when the entire world started demanding answers that the Soviets finally, grudgingly admitted there'd been an accident. It took 36 agonizing hours after the explosion for the government to finally pull the trigger and order an evacuation. And the message they broadcast to the city was chillingly brief. Take only essential belongings. You will return in a few days. So thousands of people piled onto buses, leaving basically their entire lives behind. Warm dinners were literally left cooling on tables. Family photos stayed on the walls. Pets were left waiting by the door. They had no idea they were never ever coming back. In just a few hours, a thriving, young city was turned into a permanent ghost town. And the destruction wasn't just human. The ecological fallout was staggering, spreading all the way across Europe, ruining farmland and contaminating milk supplies. But if you want to see ground zero for this environmental devastation, you look at the woods right next to the plant, an area that quickly earned the grim nickname the Red Forest. The pine trees there absorbed such a mind-boggling amount of radiation that they literally turned a sickly reddish-brown and just died standing up. To this day, it remains one of the most highly contaminated patches of Earth on the entire planet. Section 3. Heroes of the Cleanup. The fight to contain the fallout. So with the reactor core literally open to the sky and spewing radioactive poison every single second, the Soviet Union had to mobilize on a scale that is almost hard to comprehend. It took a staggering 600,000 people to tackle this completely unprecedented mess. They were known as the liquidators. We're talking soldiers, firefighters, miners, and everyday citizens who were suddenly thrust into the most hazardous working conditions in human history. And let's be absolutely clear here. Their personal sacrifice is the only reason this didn't turn into an extinction-level event for half of Europe. The daily reality for these liquidators was just grim beyond belief. Imagine having to manually shovel highly radioactive rubble, or going street by street hosing down entire apartment buildings just to wash off the radioactive dust. And heartbreakingly, teams were sent into the abandoned zones to hunt down and kill all the contaminated pets that had been left behind, all while scrambling to build giant physical barriers to contain the site. Every single shift, they were absorbing incredibly dangerous doses of radiation. But honestly, nothing captures their raw bravery quite like what happened on the roof of death. The roof of the exploded reactor was completely covered in lethal radioactive graphite blocks. The government initially tried sending in remote-controlled robots to push the rubble off the edge, but the radiation was so overwhelmingly intense that it literally fried the robot's circuits. The machines died, so they had to use humans. A liquidator would sprint out onto the roof, frantically grab a heavy, glowing chunk of debris, heave it over the edge, and sprint back inside. And they were strictly timed. They had less than 60 seconds to do this before they absorbed a fatal dose of radiation. And while that frantic battle was raging up on the roof, there was an equally desperate race against time happening deep underground. Scientists realized that the superheated, molten reactor core was slowly melting right through the concrete foundation. If it hit the massive pools of groundwater underneath the plant, it would trigger a secondary steam explosion that would have made the first blast look tiny. So they brought in hundreds of coal miners. Working around the clock in suffocating heat and intense radiation, these guys hand-dug a massive tunnel straight beneath the active reactor to reinforce the floor and prevent the ultimate catastrophe. Section 4. The lasting global warming, the scars of Chernobyl. So, the fires were eventually put out, but the monster inside Reactor 4 was still very much alive. Engineers were faced with a massive problem. How do you permanently bottle up an exploded nuclear reactor? Well, it turns out it's a generational effort. Back in 1986, working at incredibly dangerous speeds, they hastily built the sarcophagus, this giant, ugly concrete tomb poured directly over the ruins to trap the radiation. But you know, concrete breaks down, it cracks. So, fast forward 30 years to 2016, and the world had to come together to build the new safe confinement. This thing is an absolute beast. It's one of the largest movable steel structures ever created by humans, and they literally had to slide it on rails right over the old, crumbling sarcophagus to keep the radiation contained for the future. But the true scars of Chernobyl go way deeper than concrete and steel. The human cost was absolutely devastating. There was a huge, tragic spike in thyroid cancer, especially in kids who had unknowingly drank contaminated milk. Not to mention the decades of psychological trauma and chronic health issues for the survivors. And on a political level, it was an earthquake. The fact that the government had so blatantly lied to its own people completely shattered whatever public trust was left. A lot of historians actually point to the cover-up and the staggering economic cost of Chernobyl as a massive factor that helped bring down the entire Soviet Union just a few years later.
And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer scale of the fallout. It is honestly hard to wrap your head around. In 1986, Chernobyl was the future, a bustling, energetic hub of 49,000 young people. Today, because it's still far too dangerous for humans to live there, it has ironically become one of the most bizarre and unique wildlife refuges on the planet. You literally have packs of wolves and wild horses roaming freely through the decaying, radioactive ruins of Soviet grocery stores and apartments. Nature has completely taken over. But that invisible danger, it's going to stay baked into the soil for thousands of years. Which brings us to the most crucial takeaway from this whole explainer. Chernobyl wasn't just a glitch in the system. It wasn't just some freak isolated accident. It is a profound, incredibly stark warning. It forces us to ask, when basic safety is just brushed aside, and when those in power choose to hide the truth from the public to save face, what is the ultimate price we end up paying for our technological progress? It's a heavy question, right? But it's one that echoes out of the ruins of 1986, and one we absolutely must keep asking ourselves today.
Welcome to the Myth Story channel. Like, comment, and share, and be sure to subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications for more.